the idea that Yazidi women are being raped and completely dehumanized and murdered, that we have girls in Nigeria who are still missing. Now, some people would want to say that that's the issue of sexual violence, that's the issue of misogyny, that's the issue of patriarchy. And I want to say that those are the issues that undergird global capitalism. And that if you think you can understand global capitalism without its sexual violence, that is a serious mistake. Now I'm not equating the systems. I am complicating them with each other and saying that you cannot get rid of one without assaulting both. And in that process, given the global world, the privileging of whiteness and Westernness gets involved in whose violence and whose sexual violence is even seen, let alone said to be a problem. You know, just as an aside, it wasn't until Donald Trump started talking about doing sexual violence to white women that he really got himself in trouble. You know, he could talk about Mexicans, he could talk about other groups that really are the problem, Muslims, terrorism. But so the idea here again of the way that patriarchy and misogyny is used to protect capitalism at the very same time that it also violates all women. So I don't know about you, but if you're thinking, Zillah, this sounds complicated, I think so. You know, and do I have all the answers for the questions? No, but I actually think that there are new systems of power that require new questions, and that we have to not be frightened of asking a question that we might not yet know the answer to. So that's kind of the most earnest, honest underpinning of what we're going to do here today. So there's a language that is helpful and necessary, I think, to this moment. Binaries, for me, are just always a problem. In my classroom, when students will say to me, so, is it patriarchy or capitalism? Is it capitalism or racism? I say, you know, or is a very problematic methodological question. The answer to or is always both and all. Then figure out how it's both and all. Okay, do you understand what I'm saying? The word, if you're already looking for either or, you're not going to be able to find the answer. Okay, so the binary, the notion, even if it comes from the binary of male-female, man-woman, black-white, those, you know, the mixed races of our world are much more present than any clear, divisive notion of clarity here. So again, in whose interest is the binary? Those who rule, those with power, because they want us not to be able to see the complexity, the diversity, what I will call here, along with many black feminists in the US, intersectionality, the notion that things intersect, they overlap. A woman named Barbara Smith, also a black feminist in the US, she says, I don't like the word intersectionality because it's too neat. It makes it sound like you have, you know, lines that intersect. She says, I'm a woman at heart, in her kitchen always. She says, I think of the marbled cakes I make. Okay, so she says race, sex, class, gender, they marble with each other. You don't always know where they make contact or not, but that they are what? They are embedded in each other. It's with that I ask you to think about, if you are thinking of any identity or any site, that it is never singular, it is always multiple, and then to try to find out exactly what the layers of multiple are. Now that's also why I think if you want to think politically, the site you should start with always is the female body. If you can find out what is happening to the female body, you can have an understanding of politics. Now, for those of you who are thinking, I don't get that connection, to me, politics is the distribution and mystification of the systems of power. So the point here is, where is the site that those systems of power are located the most intimately? The female body. It is why the female body is always up for contestation, whether it has a right to vote, whether that body has a right to control her own reproductive means, whether she can be free from violence. Why is it that every war has a rape camp? So the point here is to say, let's really shift it up a bit and say, when Clausewitz said, war is politics in another form, I argue misogyny is politics in another form. If you can work from that, then you will have the multiplicity. The female body is not a singular site. Everything happens and is written and is argued there. So in this moment, it seems that one must be present, and being present means, for me, that you must commit yourself to being an anti-imperialist feminist. So you have to be against war and any kind of feminism that is devoted to that. And if it takes us to conversations, there are multiple feminisms. There are as many feminisms as there are nation states. Within any country, there are multiple feminisms: liberal, Marxist, socialist, anti-racist, anarchist. The newest form being called Muslima, which is the Muslim women's identification as Muslim feminists. Some of them don't like the term Islamic feminist. Okay, so the point here of the multiplicity of feminisms is why? Because as a site of struggle and power, there will be many understandings about how to fight for freedom, how to fight for justice. There is not just one. There's not just two. So that here, the richest politics in my mind is the politics of that discussion that really embraces the feminisms of the globe and really tries to figure out what the most expansive and liberatory and inclusive notion that can be. And I would argue that maybe at this moment there's no way to get there, but if we are on that road, then we are doing important political work, both in theory and in action. So, you know, I am a great devotee of Rosa Luxemburg, who argued you can't do theory without practice, you can't do practice without theory, and she says just make sure you don't limit your theory to your practice. The initial work that I did on that was, you know, I was somewhat rarely born to a communist family in the United States. My parents both had been in the Communist Party, and in those days, when I asked them why they were in the Communist Party, they said, well, any white person who believed in civil rights for blacks in this country, we had no other party to belong to but the Communist Party. So I grew up as a child very much involved in the civil rights movement. My three sisters and I, you know, when we were 8, 10, 12, you know, and then through our teen years, participated in picket lines, were arrested very early on in life on this issue. Again, in terms of the bipolar, we were considered race traitors as white people, and of course, most of the support that I had as a child was from blacks. Whites really didn't like our family very much, truth be told. So the earliest developments were as a commitment to social justice. But, and of course, my sisters and I were always taught that everything was expected of us, but it was before feminism was a politics that was articulated very much. Now, of course, we were brought up to believe in the wrongness of wealth, the wrongness of excess, and the wrongness of imperialism and exploitation. But when I went into graduate school and was working on my PhD, I started to feel like the criticism of capitalism wasn't good enough because I had become part of the women's movement in the United States. And so I started wondering about the question of patriarchy and misogyny. Now, again, early on at that time, I didn't like the word misogyny because it meant hatred of women. And I didn't really believe that women were hated by men. I must say, again, I told you I changed my mind a lot. So by the time I worked with women who had been in the rape camps in Bosnia, then I did think misogyny was the only thing that could explain this on some level, but not only by itself. It was part of a war ethic that then became very difficult to really argue. But what I did think was totally wrong was that the Bosnian War was represented as an ethnic war and not as a gender war, okay? So again, this idea that you get to choose one thing, you know, and most of the time politically, if you're given a choice, it's never gender, it's never sex. So to me, sometimes I just was committed to knowing that it had to be there because I saw it, okay? In terms of action, I saw it, but I don't see it in theory, you know? I don't see it in the way that then makes it seeable, because if there isn't a language to see it, it becomes invisible. So the politics of naming is really important to me because it's through naming that we can then mobilize an action against it, okay? So that led to some of the discussions when I was figuring out my PhD focus. It was, I wanted it to be to articulate a new concept of capitalist patriarchy rather than the critique by feminists of capitalism. So one night in the middle of the night, I said, oh, I have it wrong. I'm calling it patriarchal capitalism, and it's capitalist patriarchy. And what I was realizing is that having been brought up as a Marxist, you know, that Marxism was still putting capitalism at the center for me. And it was just, you know, hard work, thinking, discomfort, whatever, that in the middle of, I got up, I wrote it down. The next morning I thought, what was I thinking? And but then that became the theme of really showing that there is a difference between calling it capitalist patriarchy. And what is that? It's that patriarchy came before capitalism. It was in feudalism and it's in socialism. So, sorry, all right? Capitalism is the shorter method here. And for those of you who think that you can reform capitalism, of course you can. And you can reform capitalist patriarchy. And there's lots of different ways that people do that. And some of the latest ways is people thinking what we need to do is get women in positions of power, in the positions of power of capitalist patriarchy, although they wouldn't call it that probably, and that they then can make it fair for women. And my argument, after many, many years, is you cannot reform capitalist patriarchy. Why? Why can't you? Because patriarchy underpins capitalism and capitalism underpins patriarchy. So if you begin to reform one, you have to be willing to revolutionize the process. Okay? So we already now have as proof that you can have women as leaders in these structures, and they do not lead to the end of misogyny. They do not lead to an end to capitalism. What we might wonder at the moment, or at least I do in the United States, has the chaos created so much disabling of the systems as we have known them that what we are going to get are new forms of much more complicated forms of patriarchy and capitalism. Now, the argument, the 1%, right? You know that, do you, yeah? So the idea that the 1% is really, it's not fair, 99% of those across the globe are suffering. Well, clearly there are important movements saying enough. This level of excess is just way too much. But it is interesting that that same level of excess right now is happening in terms of the system of misogyny as well. So Hillary Clinton says we need to break the ceilings, right? And what I have said to her and written publicly in the United States is, I'm really not concerned with the ceiling. I'm concerned with getting most of us out of the basement. Okay, so the idea again of where we are located, what we want, what you can get. The point again is, how is it that you can really recognize any human as fully human with no limitations to what that might mean? All right, then that means thinking in a different kind of way about what is possible in terms of human imagination and political risk. And of course, I think that all of us need to think about just how much am I willing to risk. I know this for myself in the work I do, particularly in multiracial groups. If I am not willing to risk everything, how can I expect trust? So the point here is that we have to be willing to try to make a world where we may actually have different privilege, less privilege, in order to make it possible for there to be fairness for more people. So the idea again of, I think that the only good politics is a politics that pushes us to think as intimately about ourselves as we are willing to think publicly, politically, about the structures of power that encompass and require things from us. So just to go back for anyone who might want this, and I'm going to do it very quickly, is that when you're just looking at capitalism, you see the economy. You might see capitalism or socialism. But when you open it to capitalist patriarchy, you see the economy, but also the family. You see the division of labor, but you see the sexual division of labor. You see productive labor and what is called non-productive labor. You see wage labor, but you also see domestic labor. You see the political, but you will also see the personal. You see the economic, but you also see the sexual. So the point here is you just open your visor. Now, that was a very beginning stage of my opening, when I was just opening capitalism to patriarchy. And today, this is way too simple. But what I'm trying to say is that these are some of the openings that stop the preference for the idea that one has to earn a wage in order to be said to be laboring, to not be able to see sex workers in a system of sex trafficking, in a system of global capital misogyny. So again, some of the changes, some of the movements, etc. So I mean, of course, he's been doing some of the newest work in terms of what Marxism and what progressive work should look like, and I think he does it to the absolute exclusion of the problem of patriarchy and misogyny. So I really see that as just not acceptable on the intellectual, methodological level of today. And just to make one quick point, You know, he now is very involved with thinking about people's bodies, and he talks about we need to think about everything, you know, excrement and urine and blood and heart type and all these things. And he says because this defines a person's life. But he does it to the absolute exclusion of menstruation. I mean, like his body that he's thinking about is male. So if that's what's in your mind, if you're thinking about citizenry and humanity and human beings, and you don't at least have two kinds, which isn't enough to go with the sexes. So again, on a much more public level as well, people were so embracing the Pope for him being such a progressive and being so anti-poverty and really saying that the church must embrace equality, economic equality for everyone, and at the same time being against abortion, any kind of rights for women in the church. And I'm thinking, this is hellish thinking for this moment we live in. A pope is, what was worse than what he was saying was the way that progressives across the globe were saying how fabulous he is, as though he has not made the hugest contradiction possible, that the main reason for poverty for women is when they cannot control their reproductive selves. So the idea that poverty and the body have nothing to do with one another for women, I mean, I just really was at my wit's end. And I mean, you know, I know this is the Pope, but whatever. So did any of you read Piketty's new book called Capital? Okay. Well, you'd never know that chattel slavery was one of the major reasons for capital accumulation. And is there nary a word in that book about women's labor or the labor of women's bodies? Not one. Not one. Okay? So my point here is that I did very old work years ago saying capitalism is not a sufficient modality to think through. And I just want you to know that if you've been doing this for 40 years, and then you hear the Pope and Piketty as the new genius of the world for thinkers, well, you've heard my voice get loud. Okay? So that's just, I mean, it doesn't do justice to any of those issues, but it does give us at least some kind of hopefully working guide for you to ask your questions and become part of this. So I'm just going to read a few words from a piece that I presented recently in the States, okay? And it was for a conference called Feminisms Against Empire. And so I started with Antonio Gramsci's quote, "The old is dying, and the new is not yet born." Okay? We have wars with drones and fewer, if any, boots on the ground, but 60 million people are driven from their homes in 2016 from wars in the United States. We don't even recognize that Obama has been at war longer than any president before. I call this invisible visibility, like nationalism itself. And I do think that a real misogynist form of thinking is invisible visibility. And that's usually the place of women in politics. You know, that we are visible but invisibly so. And if you're thinking that makes no sense, yes, it doesn't. Okay, you're allowed to at least. All right. Millions of women are in the streets in Brazil decrying the white male coup and the toppling of Dilma Rousseff, standing firmly for what they call democracy. And 1 in 3 women suffer domestic violence in Brazil. Yet, in Brazil, what do we have? We have women who are violated and defiant. So my point here is not to talk about misogyny as though it makes victims. It makes resistors. If you what? Name the invisible visibility. So genders and races and sexes and classes are more complex and therefore fluid, but they're also more rigid and stuck. And both of those things, the inequality is just more inhumane than ever, and at the same time, there is more fluidity than ever. So in the United States, we have blacks being murdered by our police in a regular fashion this past year, at the same time that the economic diversity of blacks is so much more complicated than during chattel slavery. So chattel slavery, to be black meant you were poor. Today it means that you may be poor. It sometimes means you probably will be poor, but there's a huge difference. So really the differentiation of economic class is used to hide the homogeneity or redefine it. Now that's the same for sex and gender. There's a much more differentiated set of economic classes of women in every country today. It's the brilliance of misogyny. And it's also very much at the base of people believing what? That you can make it democratic, right? I mean, in other words, that if we've already started to shift and mix it the way we have, then we can just keep mixing it. But not so. I mean, that is what the 1% is about. It's also about why so much more violence seems to be happening, as was argued in 2013 with the horrific rapes in India and the massive demonstrations against rape culture. But so much of that discussion was, as women start moving into the public space, that you will be punished. In the United States, Roger Ailes, the mafioso of Fox News, he finally is brought down for having sexually violated 20 women on the job, but many people say, you're going to go into the public sphere, then you be ready for it. Okay, so the point here again is the differentiation and the complexity of these systems. So one of the questions is, are we really across the globe facing more and more organized feminisms and therefore more and more organized misogyny? All right, but I think it's both. And therefore, the idea really is then how do you move that politics forward? So this was one of my summing up statements at the conference. Okay, so I think I'm just going to stop in deference to where I am with a statement by Imbed Carr, who I read him again just about 2-3 years ago. And he says, democracy has not eradicated the caste system, it has entrenched and modernized it. So I'm starting to wonder in similar fashion, democracy has not eradicated the gender system, it has entrenched and modernized it. So in other words, what we are seeing at this particular moment with somebody like a Modi or a Trump, I see unbelievable similarities with all due respect, that they really hold to a traditional form of patriarchy and really are fighting against modernized forms of it. But we don't want to mistake fighting for modernized patriarchy as being anti-patriarchal.